An enormous mega-project joined by more than 150 countries around the world. A project that promised new airports, motorways, and seaports. A project that sold dreams of creating the future versions of Dubai and Singapore. But today, many of these mega-projects lie unfinished, and those dreams appear shattered. Some countries are buried under crushing debt, while others are left with abandoned ruins. This was China's biggest global mega-project, known as the Belt and Road Initiative. There was a time when people called it the project of the century. But today, many describe it as a geopolitical disaster, and the countries that suffered the most were the poorer nations that had been shown these beautiful promises. So, what exactly went wrong that people are now questioning a superpower like China? Welcome once again to ALGEM TV. In 2013, when China's President Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI for short, it was described as the biggest plan of the century. Its goal was to build a modern Silk Road through railways, highways, and ports that would connect Asia, Africa, and Europe. China's mission was to help poor countries move toward development while presenting itself as a global leader. This vision shocked the world. More than 140 countries showed interest in the project, and many poorer nations immediately began taking loans from China. Before long, China had invested nearly $2 trillion into the initiative. But this money was not given as aid. It was provided in the form of loans to countries that Western banks and the IMF had already considered too risky to lend money to. Soon, however, the true nature of the BRI began to emerge. It was not just an infrastructure project. It was also part of China's geopolitical and economic strategy. At the time, China's industrial capacity had grown enormously. Every year, the country was producing millions of engineers, but it was becoming difficult to provide jobs for all of them inside China. So China created a plan to export its workforce and expand its geopolitical influence. The strategy was simple. Poorer countries would receive loans for BRI projects, and Chinese companies and workers would carry out those projects, benefiting China's own economy and workforce. One of the biggest criticisms of the BRI is what many call debt trap diplomacy. Critics argue that China gave such massive loans to poorer countries that they could never realistically repay them. As a result, those countries were forced to hand over land or important infrastructure to China. The most famous example is Sri Lanka. Chinese officials promised Sri Lankan leaders that if they built a new port in the Indian Ocean, the country could become a regional trade hub like Dubai. Sri Lanka already had the Colombo port, which functioned as a transshipment hub, where containers from large vessels were transferred to smaller ships. But China convinced Sri Lanka to build another deep-water port along the busy shipping route, stretching from the Strait of Malacca to the Suez Canal. This project became the Hambantota port. Sri Lanka decided to take a $3 billion loan from China, but China imposed strict conditions. Chinese firms alone would construct the port. The loans had relatively low interest rates, but if Sri Lanka failed to repay them, China had the right to take control of the project. Construction was completed, but Hambantota port never became successful. Feasibility studies later showed that the port was not even necessary. In fact, only around 30 to 40 ships stopped there each year. Since the port generated little revenue, repaying the loans became impossible. Eventually, in 2017, Sri Lanka was forced to hand over the port to a Chinese company on a 99-year lease agreement. Today, almost all of the port's revenue goes to China, and many believe Sri Lanka lost part of its sovereignty in the process. But Sri Lanka was not the only country caught in this situation. Zambia, a small African nation heavily dependent on copper exports, also fell into the trap. Its leaders dreamed of modernizing the economy and launched several projects using Chinese loans. China presented itself as a better alternative to the IMF and Western lenders, whose loan conditions were often seen as harsh. However, Zambia failed to consider the hidden risks in Chinese loan agreements, especially clauses allowing China to seize assets if loans could not be repaid. By 2020, around 43% of Zambia's total foreign debt was owed to China alone. When the COVID-19 pandemic devastated trade, tourism, and copper demand, Zambia defaulted on its debt payments. The BRI also produced many so-called white elephant projects, huge and expensive projects that looked impressive but had little practical value. Montenegro, a small European country, borrowed $1 billion from China in 2014 to build the Bar-Bulger Highway. But the planning was so poor that after carving roads through mountains, the project ran out of money before completion. Today, only a 41-kilometer section exists, and it does to even connect to a final destination. The costs were so high that Montenegro's debt rose to more than 80% of its GDP, forcing the country to seek help from the IMF and the European Union. Sri Lanka also built an airport near Hambantota Port in hopes of creating regional development. The Matala Rajapaksa International Airport cost around $200 million, financed largely through Chinese loans. But airlines showed little interest, and very few passengers arrived. Today, it is often called the world's emptiest airport. Flights are so rare that animals, including elephants, are sometimes seen wandering across the runway. On the west coast of South America lies Ecuador, another country affected by BRI-related projects. Hoping to solve its energy crisis, Ecuador partnered with China to build the $6 billion Coca-Codo-Sinclair Dam. However, during construction, Chinese contractors allegedly ignored quality standards, and reports later claimed that corruption and bribery were involved. As a result, more than 17,000 cracks have reportedly appeared in the dam structure. Today, the project faces the risk of collapse, threatening not only economic disaster, but also a massive human and environmental crisis. Then came Pakistan's turn. PPEC, or the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, was presented as a $60 billion project that promised electricity, jobs, and economic growth for Pakistan. But many projects were delayed or failed altogether. Residents of Gwadar protested over shortages of water and electricity, as well as against Chinese involvement. The promised jobs did not materialize, while Pakistan's debt burden continued to grow. Today, Gwadar Port, once controlled by Pakistan's authorities, is largely managed by China. Around 91% of the port's revenue reportedly goes to Chinese companies, while Pakistan receives only about 9%. The BRI suffered another major blow when Italy, the only G7 nation to join the initiative, announced its withdrawal. China had not directly provided loans to Italy, but had signed memorandums of understanding promising investment and trade cooperation. However, most projects never materialized, and Italy gained little economic benefit. Eventually, Italian officials described joining the BRI as a big mistake. Besides Italy, countries like Malaysia, Myanmar, Bangladesh, and Nepal also canceled or renegotiated several BRI projects. Seeing these failures, the United States and Europe launched alternative initiatives such as PGIE, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, and Europe's Global Gateway Program. These initiatives promise more transparent and lower interest financing to help countries avoid falling into debt traps. At the same time, BRI strengthened ties between China and Russia. After Russia became isolated following the Ukraine war, it moved closer to China through BRI-related cooperation. This has contributed to the emergence of a new geopolitical bloc that could challenge American dominance. After spending trillions of dollars over more than a decade, many analysts now consider the Belt and Road Initiative one of the biggest foreign policy failures in modern history. Critics argue that the main problem was that BRI was never truly designed for development. Instead, it primarily served China's own interests. China wanted to export its excess industrial capacity, secure access to raw materials, expand its geopolitical influence, and promote the Chinese yuan internationally, since many loans were issued in Chinese currency. Today, the Belt and Road Initiative stands at a crossroads. China is attempting to rebrand it as BRI 2.0, with greater focus on digital infrastructure, green energy, and sustainable projects. But the world is no longer willing to trust promises alone. Countries now want projects that deliver real economic benefits rather than simply increasing debt burdens. The question is, while many countries suffered losses from the BRI, did China actually benefit from it? In reality, things did not go exactly as China had planned. China wanted to increase its global influence, but instead the BRI gave rise to accusations of debt trap diplomacy. The initiative also slowed parts of China's own economy, as Beijing now faces the burden of recovering massive unpaid loans and maintaining seized projects. On the other hand, China has gained direct or indirect stakes in more than 100 ports around the world through the BRI, which benefits its export-driven economy. And if the entire BRI network is ever completed, it could become the largest road, rail, and sea connectivity system linking Asia to Europe, potentially covering around 65% of the world's population. Hopefully, you enjoyed this Algem TV video. Don't forget to like and share it. Thank you so much for your love and support in the comments. See you again in the next amazing video.